Before we start the session, if you don't want spoilers and you really want to watch this movie with no spoilers, then you might choose the other session. There's going to be lots of spoilers in this, so just got to warn you in advance. We'll start in about another minute. We'll get going. Yeah. I think Aaron grabbed a couple of things in the first session. We're good to go? Great. We'll kick into this. All right, really good to have you guys in this. Good to have you guys in this session. Aaron's already touched a little bit on Ready Player One. We're going to tackle this again, but we're going to use some similar material. But really, what I'm interested in looking at through this session is the whole phenomenon of gaming itself. So this is not a nice prelude to the next session, which is with Thorin doing more of an open discussion about gaming. There'll probably be some overlap. We'll see how we go there. But what I want to look at is this whole virtual fix and how does the gospel relate to gaming as a phenomenon. In the story, a gunter is a person who's an egg hunter. I assume most of you guys do some gaming of some form, but often there's eggs that are hidden in games where you're going to get basically a clue or some type of extra life, or there'll be whatever. So this whole story is hidden around finding the Easter egg that's hidden, and those who search for the eggs, egg hunters, are gunters. So those who are kind of addicted to the gaming thing is the language of gunter within that story. The way we're going to tackle it is using a pretty simple reflective cycle of see, judge, act. See is basically, let's just look at this with fresh eyes. What's actually going on and why in this story? So it's more descriptive and a little bit of interpretation. Judge is where I'm going to step into the biblical story, particularly using creation, fall, redemption, just a simple threefold kind of narrative. So we're going to judge this story in line with, where do we see the good, where's the bad, how might you reform it? And then act, that kind of is the reforming. What would you change? Where's some wisdom in this so that we might be better in this space? And if you see the language of MMORPG coming up. We're talking about massively multiplayer online role-playing games, this kind of phenomenon. Now, I've got to confess up front that I am coming as an absolute outsider. So I'm bound to say some things in this that mark me out as someone who doesn't fully get this phenomenon. So treat me as an ethnologist coming from the outside, trying to make sense of this phenomenon. And hopefully you can fix up a couple of my misunderstandings on the way through. We're going to do the best job that I can, because I've spent a lot of time in the book of this, looking at data sociologically of gaming, and so I'm going to provoke some questions. We'll see where we go. What I want to start with, though, is what does gaming look like for you? So I want you to turn to your neighbour, and in a second, here's what I want you to tell them, is how much time would you spend on average playing video games, say on the average day? Do you spend much money on it? What's your favourite game or your favourite platform? So what does gaming look like for you? Okay, so just give you about a minute, chat with your neighbour. Coming out of that, I'll share a little bit of social data. That's from Fortnite, okay, so someone very happily won. For those that, all right, some might be like, I don't know. I'm like, okay, if you want to start wrapping up those conversations there. All right, so here's where you get disappointed with your speaker. The last major video game that I played was 1997, was GoldenEye. All right, but I did play a hell of a lot of GoldenEye and thought it was on the Nintendo 64. So I'm really showing my age here. This whole phenomenon, like seriously, I teach a subject called Theology for Everyday Life, and this started to get on my radar as I taught this subject because I found that about a third of the male students in theological college, when they got their final reflective assignment where they could choose any topic that they wanted to understand in depth and then reframe and to do more faithfully, a third of the male students were doing it on gaming. And I'm like, seriously? And I was looking at some of the data of how many hours, because I require them to keep data on what they actually do with their time. And I'm just looking at this going, this really literally cannot be the case. And so I started to research and I'm like, no, it actually is the case. So for instance, a phenomenon of Fortnite, you may know that they only started October last year. And it started right off the bat with about 50 million playing hours per month. across the world. It's now up to 600 million playing hours per month are logged on this game. 600 million. That's crazy. I didn't know, for instance, I found my nephews doing crazy dances, and I'm like, what the heck are you doing? I can't even do it. What are you doing? And they're like, oh, it's from Fortnite. I'm like, what? And so I get them to show me, and they're telling me about dancing on people's graves, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's interesting. But then one of my best mates is a pastor. He seems to go between, massively gaming, where he bought like a multi-$1,000 VR full setup and tells me it's for ministry outreach. And then about 2 months later, when I discover, things aren't great and he's spending a few too many hours, that he sells it at half the price and then buys it back 3 months later. And I'm like, what is going on? Another of my friends who's one of the youngest criminal prosecutors for all of Queensland. He's incredibly bright, but he basically has mastered about 15 different games. So in his free time, when he's not reading law cases, he's playing God of War. And he's a young dad who's basically visualising protecting his son, Ethan, as he grows up and guiding him through. And I'm just like, I'm trying to make sense of this. That the revenue globally last year was $100 billion from gaming. And it's rising at about 15% per year. So this is something quite interesting. It's incredibly immersive. It's about 3 times the size of the movie industry in terms of revenues. So it's crazy in terms of the size. It's about the same size as the sporting industry globally. That's how big we're talking about with gaming. So it is quite the phenomenon. So let me talk. Also, anyone watch Pokemon? You even know what that is? She's got 2.4 million followers who watch her game and talk about games she's playing. There's a whole YouTube equivalent. You guys probably already know this. I'm just expressing my amazement because I'm coming from the outside going, what? Twitch, a whole basically streaming thing for whether it's PUBG or PlayerUnknown Battleground. Thank you. I've actually had to learn some names in this. All kinds of stuff that's going on. Some of the data is quite interesting too. They find that 80% of households have more than one gaming device. We've got things like the average age of players is 34. It's going to sound really weird, but you're just speaking so loudly. Yeah, sure. I'll turn So you just want to drop the mic, right? Yeah, or drop my voice down. I'll talk with my inside voice. Yeah, so we've got this thing of the average age of gamers is about 34 now, which has really gone massively up from what it originally started around the 20s, kind of, even going back to say 6 years or 7 years. Another thing, which I'll come back onto, is the amount of time that people play. Across the board of those who game, it's actually 89 minutes per day on average, across the board. And 98 is actually male. So that's male average, and it's about 70-something for female. So a lot of this data actually comes from, assuming this is working, oh, there we go, comes from Digital Australia Report. And Digital Australia Report basically is nationally representative out of Bond University. And they've got some incredible data. Anyway, I'll give links at the end to what you can look at, and I'll unpack some of this as we go through the talk. But I just found it absolutely stunning. So 67% of Australians play video games. So this is huge. This is not a side thing. This is not a few people doing it. This is, across the board, mammoth. So what sense do we make of that? So let's talk a little bit about Ready Player One. Thankfully, Aaron's already introduced us somewhat to what this is about. But let's see if we know some of the characters. And then out of this, I'll talk about how it hangs together as a plot, watch a clip, and then I'm going to get into the judge movement, so from C to judge what should be going on here. Who's the key character in this story? Anyone know? Who's watched this, by the way? A few? Who's the central character? So, the blue one. Real name, Wade, also known as Parzival. He's chosen a name that basically represents, the kind of knight's quest, the one who finds the Holy Grail. So he's taken this kind of questing identity on. His sidekick is H, his good friend. We'll talk about H's character a bit later. Artemis is kind of the love interest, but she's also a competitor in one sense. They're both competing for the same thing. And then we go into Sho and Daito. They're two other competitors who together they end up making the high five, kind of cooperating together. And they're all egg hunters, gunters. Anorak is James Halliday, and James Halliday is the one who designed this whole kind of setup called the Oasis. The Oasis, I'm not going to use my notes too much, but it's basically epistemology, ontological, anthropocentric, immersive systems kind of thing. Is basically, it's an acronym for human-centered, immersive sensory experience, and that's what they call the Oasis, which is essentially everyone goes into this, whether for your education, for your fun, for gaming. It's one basic world where you can create multiple worlds within that, and it brings in all of culture all into the one space. They're using the VR headsets and the haptic gloves and this kind of thing to be able to engage it. Nolan Sorrento is essentially the baddie, if you want to use simple language, the antagonist. And essentially he runs this group called IOI, Innovative Online, I'm going to get all the acronyms wrong in this, but basically they're the ones who are trying to solve this whole riddle left by Anorak. They're trying to solve this whole puzzle that they can actually get control of the whole Oasis for commercial reasons. And they've got all of these people who they hire called sixes because they're just represented by 6 digits rather than a name. And basically 6 often representing the number of fallen as well. And basically they're all in there to try and work together as a team to control the system, to give full rights commercially. So the gunters are trying to undercut them. So that's the basic sense. Now if you think of a story in this simple setup, like say with Little Red Riding Hood, you've got a sender, the mum sends the agent, Little Red Riding Hood, for the task of delivering goodies to the grandma. The big bad wolf gets in the way as the impediment or the antagonist, which is helped by the woodsman. So if you were to map this kind of story, essentially we've got James Halliday, Anorak, sending all the people who want the gunters, the egg hunters, sending them for the task of finding the egg. You've got to get 3 keys to unlock the puzzle that'll then get you the egg, which basically represents you win not just the competition, but you get control of the Oasis. Because he's now passed away. That's the backstory. He's passed away, but he's left this kind of puzzle. And he was big in 80s culture, which is why there's the 80s all the way through this. So he's left almost like a Bible, his almanac of his life and his reflections, and everyone needs to know that in order to solve the puzzle. They're opposed by Nolan Sorrento and the IOI, and they're helped, Wade particularly is helped by the high five. There's also this Ogden Morrow character who co-designed the game, who is kind of involved in this movie as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch a trailer of a couple of minutes, and straight out of that, I'm going to switch gears, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just present somewhat of a brief theology of technology. Just 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes. Because what I want to do is lay a baseline biblical narrative so that we can then look at this with fresh eyes to ask how does this phenomena of the massively multiplayer online role-playing games and gaming as a whole, how does that relate to the biblical story? So let's watch this trailer and then I'll do a short theology of technology.
My name is Wade Watts. I gotta pick that name because it sounds like a superhero's alter ego, like Peter Parker or Bruce Banner. But he died when I was a kid, my mom too. And I ended up here, sitting here in my tiny corner of nowhere. There's nowhere left to go. Nowhere. Except the Oasis. A whole virtual universe. People come to the Oasis for all the things they can do. But they stay because of all the things they can be.
Can you feel this?
Yeah. It's the only place that feels like I mean anything. The Oasis was the brainchild of James Halliday.
Hello. If you're watching this, I'm dead. I created a hidden object, an Easter egg. The first person to find the egg will inherit $500 billion and total control of the Oasis itself.
Who is this Parzival? And how the hell is he winning?
Find him.
Just a game.
is nothing less than a war for control of the future.
Welcome to the rebellion, Wade.
Like many of you, I only came here to escape. But I found something much bigger than just myself. Are you willing to fight?
Help us save the Oasis.
Let me just do a brief theology of technology. In the beginning, God planted a garden and he put us in it. Be fruitful and multiply, he said. And that's the only command we've consistently kept with a smile. But God continued, fill the earth and subdue it. And this is our first mission in the world. As the Lord God tends and cares for us, we are to tend and care for his garden. And when we garden God's way, we mirror his image to all of creation. We work and play alongside God our Father. And God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, I'm not much of a gardener. Neither of my thumbs is particularly green, but notice what God didn't say. He didn't tell us to wander around the garden, al natural, grabbing fruit off the garden floor and leaving only footprints. Gardening actually means getting your hands dirty. And God didn't tell us to garden without a rake. Cultivating is hard work and it takes tools. And in due time, Adam and Eve's descendants would use picks and shovels, jackhammers and jumper leads, power tools, personal computers and gaming consoles. And to varying degrees, God still pronounces this very good. Cultivation is what lies behind culture. And it's no coincidence that the biblical story starts in a garden, but it ends in a landscaped city. And as any horticulturalist knows, tending the earth takes study and technique. Science, technology, even gaming are part of God's plan to bless the world and to reflect his image. The issue is how we journey from the garden to the city. You see, on the tragic day when we ate the forbidden fruit, potentially an apple, technology became both a blessing and a curse. So would our techniques to form and transform the world, would they magnify or mutilate the image of God in us? Do our devices and our consoles, do they draw us into God's presence, engaging his quest? Or do they depress our desire for his kingdom? Pretty much everything we see in this room is touched by technology. And I recognise it's daytime, but if we stripped it away, very disturbing thought, you'd be sitting naked on the ground worshipping God in the dark. Clothes, books, projectors, microphones, moisturisers, MMOs. It's all part of technology, unless you just want to separate high-tech off. It's all technology. And each of us draws the line at some point. In Amish communities, your clothes can feature buttons but not zippers. Did you know that? Why buttons, not zippers? Well, you can make buttons, but you've got to buy zippers. And it can seem like semantics. I'm good with EFTPOS, but I won't use email. Facebook is fine, but Twitch wastes time. Tetris, Minecraft, and Wii Sports are engaging, but God of War and Fortnite and WoW are evil. You use zippers, but I stick to buttons. There's actually no easy answers in this. But have we unplugged for long enough to get a fresh perspective? Do we unthinkingly upgrade with the crowd? Can we hear God's still small voice calling us to switch off the machine and become a counterculture? What would Jesus do? Can you picture Jesus updating his online profile while texting Peter to see if there's a better social offer than serving bread to feed the 5,000? Or dancing on a disciple's virtual grave after smashing the apostles in a battle royale? I don't know, maybe. Maybe not. But how would Jesus live in this kind of virtual world? An old Chinese proverb says that if you want to know about the water, don't ask a fish. I don't know if you've noticed, but each of us is immersed in an electric ocean. The average young adult crams nearly 9 hours of media content, music, television, videos, internet, movies, including 89 minutes on average of gaming, into 7 hours exposure per day, multitasking or rapidly switching between tasks, as the case may be. We are awash in electronics. So our task in this time is to seek an out-of-water experience, not just to rationalise what we presently do, but to step back, perhaps as a newbie like me, and actually look at it with different eyes and say, what's actually going on? If we are seriously about following Jesus and seeking first his kingdom, not just rationalising our present choices, then how should we live faithfully in an electronic environment? How should we image God in a high-tech world? Now, all of us, I assume, have got some pretty positive experiences of high-tech, how it's been a blessing to us. There's no surprises there. But I think we often struggle to recognise or acknowledge how technology is a two-edged sword, how it can magnify and it can mutilate God's image in us. And that can vary from person to person. So there's no universal, well, this phenomena is always going to mutilate God's image. Depends on the user. You make meaning. You're not just a dog like in Pavlov's experiments with stimulus response, where the same input leads to the same outcome for every person. You make meaning in the way you engage these games. But we need to judge what should actually be going on through a biblical lens. And the key question throughout the rest of this session is this: does my use of technology, and particularly gaming, does it magnify or does it mutilate the image of God in me? How would Jesus have me game? So that's where we're going in this session. And that's just kind of a baseline theology of technology here. So the way I'm going to get at it is through three movements, and this is how we're going to look at the movie. The first one is creational design, then cultural idolatry, and then we're going to look at see, judge, act, healing action. So creational design, what we're going to do is look at Ready Player One and the whole phenomenon of gaming, and we're going to ask, where do I see creational intent or insight in this structure? Where do I see the good of the garden in this? God's original intentions expressed. How does this seem to align with what God's about? And we need to affirm that. We might even augment that in the way that we use this technology. Second one then is cultural idolatry. Where do I see an idolatrous distortion where I take something maybe that's even good, but I make it God? It actually silences the call of Jesus on my life. Where do I see that misdirection? And we need to critique and confront that because it's perverting the good. We might even need to flee that at times. Okay? And the last part then in action is what kind of healing action is possible? We need to discern and enact some plans to transform the world as a taste of what will be when God sets everything right. How does your gaming magnify or mutilate God's image in you? So we're going to watch a clip of 1:34. We're going to have 3 clips for each of these sections. The first clip is leading us into how does gaming magnify God's image in me? Where's the good of gaming? This clip comes from towards the end of the movie, and it's basically as Wade is rallying the troops, rallying all of the gunters across the whole of the Oasis to come and fight against the IOI to stop them from taking control of the whole Oasis. And he's trying to call them to a quest. Let's watch this clip and then we'll discuss together the good of gaming.
Citizens of the Oasis, I am Parzival, first to the key. I'm here talking to all of you now because our future is being threatened by people who will stop at nothing to win this contest. Some of you already know this, and you've lost much more than just your avatars or your weapons. Some have lost their freedom. Some have lost their lives. And now, this. A force field around the third challenge. I only came here to escape the shitty hands of my film. But I stayed, like many of you, because I found something much bigger than just myself. I found a cause. I found my friends. And yes, I know it's kind of a groaner, but I found love. And I don't want to lose that to this colossal douchebag, Nolan Sorrento.
This guy. Back to work, people.
He thinks that we're all too distracted to even notice him. Nolan Sorrento, and we will put up a fight.
Son, Sir, this is going to Alex. It's absolutely everywhere.
And now we're supposed to hand in the oasis?
All right, so we're going to do this as a whole group rather than doing short discussions, but it will require that we're pretty interactive here if that's cool. So don't be shy, because I'm wanting to make the most of the time. Where do you see, whether in your own life or in things like Ready Player One, where do you see the good of creation? Where do you see gaming magnify God's image in you and call you back to what you're originally created to do? Great relationships, and I'll get into the data soon, but most people actually, the image of the gamer isolated is actually a minority. Most people do game socially. So I think that's, from an outsider's perspective, I must admit, somewhat surprised, because the media presentation of this is quite different. Yep.
Living the story, you get an opportunity to live the story rather than just...
Great. So the sense of a quest, of creating and engaging with character, uses great imagination. And God put us in that garden again to cultivate it, to tend and to keep it and care for it. And that includes play. That's part of culture as well. And that's expressing the image of God in us. What other things? Absolutely. And there's one of the things in this movie where they do what's called flixies. It's quite interesting. Flixies is where in the challenge, for instance, War Games, classic movie with Matthew Broderick, he gets through the challenge, he gets the key, but then he finds himself in a challenge where he's actually inhabiting the story, where he's got to get the lines right and play the role. So he's been characterised by stepping into this role. He's actually being formed in character and formed in identity by reenacting the way that someone else has done it before him, living virtuously in the image of someone who was virtuous. Okay. What else? Anything else?
It encourages persistence. Like people get multiple goes at things. And,
yeah, sticking at it.
Yeah, rather than just sort of being resigned to life and I'm not very good at something, I can actually learn and grow and persist.
And I think that's something that came up in the Jumanji reboot, which I thought was actually quite creative. The old one was about getting stuck in the game, but the new one was actually people who were anxious and afraid in the real world and then discovered an identity and courage in the virtual world and then were able to bring that back into the real world. So it's not just one directional. Sometimes actually the formation through a game can form you in courage and in action to be able to transplant that back into a situation where it's not so familiar. So these are some of the things that come out from this. It was interesting to me I should read from Anorak. This is in page 359 of the book. It has a kind of riddle to start with. And he says, the 3 hidden keys open the 3 secret gates, wherein the errant, the one sent on the mission, will be tested for worthy trades. And those with the skill to survive those straits will reach the end where the prize awaits. Formation of worthy trades. I think this genuinely can be part of our gaming experience. This sense of a quest, of cyber sociality. One theologian speaks about homo ludens, homo, humanity, ludens, play. They actually call ludology the study of gaming. There's a whole field of what it means to play in the image of a God who is creative and takes delight and wonder, where work is wonder, is wisdom, is play. And I think all these are part of it. That some people have raised the question that in gaming, aren't we being God? Aren't we basically playing the role of God, making worlds? And yet, isn't that the biblical narrative in one sense? The problem is not in making worlds, the problem is doing so over against God who made us. Provided you've submitted that to the God who makes, and you're a sub-creator in Tolkien's words, not a co-creator or an above-creator, provided you're doing it in partnership or acknowledging God's sovereignty as the only one who brought us ex nihilo out of nothing, then there's not necessarily a problem with that, and you might be actually being in touch through that creative act with your very identity as an image bearer, called to make, called to design. So I think this is really important. Let's look at a little bit of the data here. What we find is that the motives for playing actually are things like I want to pass some time, which is a legitimate pursuit. Even escape can be a legitimate pursuit, particularly if you've got a crappy life, to have periods where you can get some relief. That's fine. To have fun, that's not a bad thing. God actually designed us with endorphins. He designed us to experience and enjoy, to de-stress for adults as you get older, to keep your mind active, thinking of Wii Sports and those kind of things, or mind tests. So we've got all these kind of aspects to it. Motives change across time, but I think that being challenged, the excitement, the enjoyment, engaging with others is all part of it. This is particularly for the elderly community, but 84% of people who are involved in gaming said it helps improve their thinking skills, their problem solving. For the elderly, helping manage pain, fight dementia, increasing mobility. 76% say it's got an economic benefit to the country. So I think it's easy for outsiders like myself to just judge it and go, what's going on here? But actually, once you start to look at it from the inside, even the data on violence, many have argued that violence is at an all-time low in our culture. And some have argued that actually being able to practice these forms in a defined world with ethical scenarios where you've got genuine consequences depending on what you choose, even in things like Grand Theft Auto, that actually, if you consistently do the wrong thing, you'll draw the attention of the police. So there's actually a place to practice that. Let's watch the next clip now in terms of how it might deform us. This clip, I've strung together 3 bits. It goes for a few minutes, but this is essentially when Parzival wants to meet Artemis, who's the female character, and he starts being drawn towards her and realises actually what he thinks she is and what she really is might be 2 different things because of the avatar that he's inhabited and that she's inhabited.
So you've got to be more careful about who you leave the Oasis.
H, Artemis gets me. She'll get my outfit. There's just this connection. I mean, sometimes we even...
Finish each other's sentences?
Yeah,
We have that. Me and you.
yeah, I know. But that's because we're best friends, dude.
She could be a dude too. I'm serious. She could actually be a 300-pound dude who lives in his mama's basement in suburban Detroit. And her name is Chuck. Think about that.
So, I've been thinking, it'd be cool if we met up in the real world.
Nah, you were disappointed.
I wouldn't. I like you.
You don't even know me. This isn't what I really look like. This isn't my real body. Or my real face.
I don't care. I want to know your real name. My name's Wade.
What?
I said my name's Wade.
Stop.
Well, Buckaroo blows it. Shocking.
You crazy? You don't tell anyone who you are. You can't use your real name.
You're not just anyone.
You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. We've never met.
I do know you, Artie. I'm in love with you. Is this part of the challenge?
Joe! It's an ambush.
Why always in the way?
You hear what I said? I said I'm in love with you.
No, you're not. You know what I want you to know. You only see what you want you to see. That's what you're in love with.
Wow, you were amazing.
This isn't a game, Steve. I'm doing this to stop IOI. I'm talking about real-world consequences. People suffering. Actual life and death stuff.
I know.
No, you don't know. My dad died in a loyalty center. He borrowed gear. He built up debt. He moved in with a promise of working out, but he never did. IOI just raised his living expenses. Then he got sick and he couldn't afford to get out, and then he died.
I'm so sorry.
But you don't live in the real world, Steve. From what you told me, I don't think you ever have. You live inside this illusion, and I can't afford to let you distract me.
So let's talk together as a group. In what ways does gaming, and particularly we've seen here in Ready Player One, mutilate the image of God in you? If we're called to be people who cultivate God's world, who love God, love our neighbour as ourselves, and lovingly use our gifts to do something good with the garden that God gave us, in what ways is gaming mutilating God's image? In you, in others?
I think it becomes obsessive and you desire to spend more time in the game than you do in real life. Or you're constantly thinking about it when you're away from it.
Or it becomes more real to you than real world. The book all the way through keeps using the phrase real, 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 real. is this actually the real world? Now, you are really playing the game, but you're inhabiting your energy into a virtual space. And that virtual space is in one sense culture, but it's not actually cultivating the real world. It's cultivating an artificial, which is the notion of an avatar, of investing yourself in something where you're projecting an image that is actually mediated to the point that we're not making a difference in the world. So we're spending 600 million hours globally on Fortnite, which has some economic benefits, but none of which is actually dealing with a world, dealing with environmental fallout, destruction of places, poverty, debt, obesity. Think of the neglect of the body. I mean, I'll just read you one passage here for a second, which is from page 195 in the book. Wade basically says, the hour or so after I woke up in real life was my least favourite part of the day because I spent it in the real world. That was when I dealt with the tedious business of cleaning and exercising my physical body. I hated this part of the day because everything about it contradicted my other life, my real life inside the oasis. The sight of my tiny one-room apartment, my immersion rig, my reflection in the mirror, they all served as a harsh reminder that the world I spent my days in was not, in fact, the real one. I sat in the haptic chair. I got almost no exercise at all. I had a habit of overeating when I was depressed or frustrated, which was most of the time. I put on extra pounds. I couldn't squeeze into my chair. I needed a new rig. I was worried I would die of sloth before I found the egg. So I never left my apartment. Gets into the hikikomori in Japan, those shut-ins who don't want to leave. It even says basically at the end that standing there under the bleak fluorescence of my tiny one-room apartment, there was no escaping the truth. In real life, I was nothing but an antisocial hermit, a recluse, a pale-skinned pop culture-obsessed geek, an agoraphobic shut-in with no real friends or human contact. But not in the oasis. In there, I was the great Parzival, world-famous gunter and international celebrity. Nay, I was a god. So we've got these kind of challenges. Other comments? Yep.
You said earlier you can learn consequences with things through games, but at the same time, it's so theoretical and there are no really massive physical consequences. And so
You're not really suffering as a result of losing the game.
Yeah, so I think that we are desensitizing our sense of empathy in many ways where if you do blur it, the people in your real world, you don't get a sense that they really feel pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Last couple of comments, yeah?
I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with the series Westworld, based on pretty intense, but the whole idea is you can do whatever you want, whether that's good or bad. So it's feeding your desires, and that can, because we're a fallen creation, that can really lead to some horrible stuff, or good stuff, but some really horrible stuff. And one line was something about you created a prison of your own sins.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's pretty powerful.
Very similar. I mean, Ogden Morrow in this story has left the business because he's become so disenchanted with what started as something great, quote, becomes something horrible. It had become a self-imposed prison for humanity, a pleasant place for the world to hide from its problems while human civilization slowly collapses, primarily due to neglect. And then describing the real world, he says, as he gets outside this loyalty centre where people have become indentured slaves who can't get out of it, he says, as he looks at the real world, he said, a thick film of neglect covered everything in sight. Yep.
Around what gaming has the positives and the negatives, like it has the ability to give people identity and the ability to connect with people and value, but then it also has that opposite as well, where it can strip you of your identity and that loss of function of, being able to connect and be with others. So it
can be both. And it can depend on the person, and it can depend on how much you're playing, and it can depend on the game you're playing. But what's true is that the gamer themselves is the worst judge of how it's affecting them. The best judge is often a family member, a spouse, even a child, a parent. The person themselves, when you're immersed in the game, is usually very unaware of how it's actually impacting them, which is the fish in the water phenomenon. Yep.
It can become unhealthy when it's something like escapism.
Yeah.
So they're trying to get away from their hurts rather than dealing with them. And in doing so, their true self and their problems never get sorted out or dealt with. And
it's good.
They're just living as this, and it becomes very lonely existence because they're...
And it becomes isolating and relates to depression, for instance.
Because they're rarely actually interacting with people with their true self. They're projecting something else. But it can be okay if you're interacting with this yourself online, because
Yeah.
you know who you are.
But the
and
distance
confident.
between yourself and your projection can actually be part of the problem. So let me just make a few points and then I'll need to move to the last little bit here before we wrap up. Gaming disorder, interesting phenomenon, when basically the amount you're playing leads to physical consequences, loss of job, disconnection from others. It doesn't affect all your game, it affects a relatively small percentage, but the World Health Organization has now put this on their charter basically of disorders. And it was in the DSM-5 Diagnostic Statistical Manual, I think that is, talking about how this can affect people. Nicholas Carr has talked about how our addiction to quick, rapidly changing images and information has made us shallow thinkers neurologically. The blue light means it's hard to switch off. We're not as stimulated as face-to-face contact mediated through a screen. So a lot of that actual real life-to-life connection that God made us for is not met in a virtual world. And it's not making us good at deep, sustained thought that deals with real problems as opposed to just solving short-term issues. You expect it to be done in half an hour or a couple of days as opposed to sustained thought. We see that a lot of people are concerned, particularly parents of kids, about sexual predators, sex, suicide, violence, thinking of Grand Theft Auto again, the kind of things that you can act out in an imaginary world do actually have a carryover. There's questions of how it relates to violence, but you're practicing a character. So would you be prepared, like, are you lusting in your heart as Jesus talked about? Are you killing in your heart? Well, that's for you to work out before the Lord, but the idea that it's just imaginary versus real doesn't quite carry in that way. Quick comment? Yeah, that's in Proverbs, I think it is. But yeah, I mean, you've got this issue of you're picturing it, you're imagining it, you're practicing it, you're rehearsing it as a story. We saw in Florida, for instance, the guy, when he lost in an esports competition, shot down 2 guys. Now, I'm not at all saying that gaming makes you violent. Actually, the data is very inconclusive. But the amount of time that we're spending on it does seem to be an issue. For 15 to 24-year-olds, 2.5 hours, 155 minutes for men is the average time per day spent on gaming. Time that's not caring for one's body or time that's not engaging with face-to-face with family or the like. So this could be an issue. You need to work out how much time is a faithful amount of time to spend on this. Let's watch just the start of this last clip.
Because I've never felt at home in the real world. I just didn't know how to connect with the people there. I was afraid for all of my life. Right up until the day I knew my life was ending. Now that was when I realized that as terrifying and painful as reality can be, it's also the only place that you can get a decent meal.
I just want to finish up with a few comments about healing action because we're almost out of time. It's interesting in the clip that we watched earlier on with Aaron that in response to winning this game, he does 3 things. He splits the prize and the accountability with 5 people rather than just 1 because it was never meant to be a 1-player game. He then consults the wisdom of Ogden Morrow, the wisdom of the elders, to actually look at how should this be used well to stop people falling into debt or bondage. He then actually chooses a couple of days a week where you've got to unplug as like a Sabbath. You can see Spielberg coming into this with his Jewish faith. He's basically saying you need to unplug at points. In the book it says we've got to protect the integrity of the quest, that there's an integrity of this competition. You see them setting, as with many parents, some rules about how we engage. So here's some examples. I'd say one good way of looking at this is the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Get those close to you to say how your gaming impacts you before and afterwards. When you just spend a lot of time playing games, how are you different? How is it forming you over time? If it's augmenting these things, great, but if it's mutilating these things, you might need to work out some extra rules around that. Guidelines. Be authentic and truthful in your gaming, even in your avatars. Discernment and moderation are key. My 2 nephews, I came over to their place and they're into Fortnite a little bit, and I noticed that they've got these rules stuck below the Star Wars figures and next to the console. Here's their rules. This is for Fortnite. Playground mode. Playground mode is banned due to the number of fights that it causes. If at any point you feel you are stressed or uptight, leave the game, but tell others why so they don't feel bad. No yelling or mean words or getting frustrated. It's just a game. Play outside. TechWise Family from Andy Crouch. He's got some great points. like we're designed for a rhythm of work and rest. So one day an hour, 1 day a week, 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, 1 week a year, we turn off our devices and worship, feast, play and rest together. So you need wisdom for this. And it may be that unplugging exposes our addiction to have an occasional unplug from this so that we might actually be people who are well formed. So I hope that session's been helpful. It's going to lead into a panel very shortly where you can talk more about the gaming phenomenon. And again, the slides, if you want to use them, are available at bit.ly/virtual fix with a capital V, a capital F. And I can give you that link afterwards if you want that. So thanks heaps.